let's start on dot of 11:30 so that we can get maximum engagement from the scholars and dignitaries that are present in the session and from the audience as well. I won't take too much time between you and the panel, but I do want to make a couple of remarks. We have an excellent panel. As you can imagine, that we are organizing this US-India Economic Partnership on the sidelines of the visit of the US delegation, including President Trump, to India. And this is a welcome occasion, and we are very grateful to AMCHAM for agreeing to collaborate with us on this important topic of US-India economic, especially trade relations. And we are delighted to do this. And I was telling Ranjana, who's the CEO, Director General of AMCHAM, that we should be working much more together. We have an excellent panel. We have Mr. Sanjay Chadha, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Commerce, who is here. None of them need any introduction. We have Mr. Atul Dhawan, who's the Honorary Secretary and Treasurer, AMCHAM, and partner Deloitte. We have our own Professor Anwarul Hoda, Chair Professor of ICRIER's Trade Policy and WTO Research Program. We have Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, Professor at ICRIER. And of course, Ranjana Khanna, as I said, Director General and CEO of AMCHAM on the panel. The way we're going to organize this discussion is that I will request Professor Hoda and Mr. Sanjay Chadha to make a few opening remarks on what they feel are the important attributes of the US-India trade and economic relations. And then we will open it to the floor for questions. We have about an hour and a half, as I said. We'll go on until 1 p.m., a little longer if there are lots of pressing questions. But I do want to set the stage by saying that India is now sort of one of the largest countries. It used to be the fastest growing emerging market in the world. It slumped a bit, despite the fact that we've come down from 7.5%, 8% to about 5%. We remain the fifth largest economy in the world. US, of course, is the largest economy in the world. And as you know, the trade between countries that are dissimilar in nature is going to be profitable to both countries. Old theory, trade theory, tells us that trade between dissimilar countries is going to be beneficial. Now, both countries face issues about there are benefits of trade. How do you redistribute those benefits? And that's a major challenge. In both countries, trade is often seen as a villain when it is actually not the villain, according to many of us who work in the area of trade. US-India trade relations now are, as I said, at a historical high. Trade in goods and trade in services stand at over $140 billion. We have a current account surplus with the United States in both the goods and services. Goods is roughly about $21 billion or $22 billion, and the surplus in services is about $3 billion. But I think this is an extremely political issue. It's not any, focusing on current account, bilateral trade deficits in either goods or services becomes a political rather than an economic issue. There is FDI flows between United States and India. The stock of FDI of the United States in India is about $46 billion. The stock of FDI of India in the United States is roughly $10 billion. And in the last 5 years, our trade relations have magnified, have increased. So there's good news all around. But there are some niggles, of course. In every bilateral relationship, there are niggles. There are niggles around GSP. There are niggles around services. There are niggles around agriculture. There are a little bit on how tariffs, protective tariffs have been increased both on the Indian side and on the US side. On the Indian side, there are issues about raising tariffs on mobile phones. On the US side, there are increased tariffs on aluminum and steel and et cetera. And India has retaliated, raising tariffs on certain agricultural products, including almonds. There is, of course, issues relating to big tech. As you know, big tech, 4 of the CEOs of the big tech companies in the United States are of Indian origins, which signals good news for both the countries. But at the same time, there are issues around localization, data protection, there are issues around e-commerce, and there are issues around the equity caps and localization issues, local sourcing requirements around some of the operations of the big tech companies in India. All these issues, we think, when you work from an economic perspective, you think some of these issues have solutions to them. And there have been solutions in the past, and I think there are solutions to them. We have to navigate through the political sentiments and then look at the economic solutions. But there is good news ahead, and the good news is that there is a lot of collaboration, cooperation happening between India and the United States, and collaboration in whatever area you have, whether it's in defense, whether it's in energy. The possibility of collaboration then has externalities and spillover benefits into other areas. And as I said, we are natural allies. Trade between dissimilar countries, the two largest democracies, we are natural allies. So I think there is good news all around, and I hope this visit marks the beginning of what we feel could culminate in an India-US free trade agreement, albeit I think we recognize there are difficulties therein to signing an FTA, but I think over time, if this visit is seen as laying the foundation for coming closer of the two countries in economic ties, hopefully down the road we will see an India-US bilateral free trade agreement. With those remarks, let me warmly once again welcome all of you to this panel discussion, and may I invite Professor Hoda to make opening remarks, followed by Mr. Sanjay Chadha, and as I said, we will then open it up for questions. And before I do that, let me also recognize the presence of Mr. Damu Ravi, who works in the Ministry of Commerce in the Multilateral Division. Thank you, sir, so much for coming. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rajat.
Sorry, sir. Let me also recognize Eileen Nandi, Minister Councillor, for her presence. Thank you very much.
Guests on the dais and friends, I have been asked to say something about the PSAG, the Private Sector Advisory Group. But before that, I thought it would be a good idea to give some sort of a 5-minute overview of trade policy engagements between the two countries for the last 3 or 4 decades, during which it so happens that I have been somehow associated with the engagements as an insider, as a government official, and as an outsider, as a scholar. As an insider, a joint secretary, my first contact with the US delegation was on the subject of almonds. At that time, India's trade policy was like a wall. Making any request to India on trade policy was like breaking your head against the wall. But the US decided to at least make a request for better market access on almonds. President Reagan was the president, and California was his constituency. So that's how it began. The focus was on almonds. But gradually over the next 3 or 4 decades, the engagements broadened from one commodity to all commodities, from the goods sector to other sectors like services, intellectual property rights. When the suggestion was first made by the US officials to liberalize the services sector, it was looked at with horror amongst Indian policymakers. All the major services at that time, public telecommunications, insurance, banking, civil aviation, everything was nationalized. Not only the FDI was not allowed, But even the private sector in the country was not allowed to make any investments in these areas. Then the requests from the United States, the interest in the United States also broadened to investment. At that time, the FIRA was in position, and the Indian government did not want really any foreign investment to flow in. The agenda broadened further to include intellectual property rights. And that was the biggest clash between the objective of the US side to stimulate innovation and the objective on the Indian side to provide access to affordable medicine. From the Indian side, one area of interest was textiles and clothing. Gradually, as discussions and engagements continued, India became interested in the services sector, which initially, as I said, was looked at, and the initiatives were looked at with great dismay. In services, India became a very interested participant in the dialogue because of the opportunity that it provided for pursuing something of India's interest, that was movement of natural persons. But other issues have kept arising. From the Indian side now, before that I can say that these issues which were raised at that time in the 80s saw a resolution in the WTO agreement. But following that, issues keep arising. From the Indian side, it is fees for workers' visa, it is totalization. There is, as far as personnel are concerned, a basic asymmetry in the flows between the two countries. That is what has resulted in the totalization problem. And although it is of great interest to everyone, all the people who move from one country to the other, there has been no agreement on that. At that time, besides services, there was a great interest, as I said, on intellectual property rights, and that too was resolved, but the dissatisfaction on the part of the United States with the with the patents regime continues. At that time, the tariffs was a big issue. At the outset, especially in India, industrial tariffs were in the range of 100%. Tariffs have been brought down during the course of the next decades of engagement. But then, tariffs on industrial goods have been raised in some cases on the Indian side. And in some cases, these tariffs go above the bound rates. So this is how the major trade policy obstacles the treatment of those obstacles have evolved. That was a resolution, and then there are some problems again. Then there is a new crop of issues that have arisen, some of which were referred to by Rajat in his opening remarks. Price control on medical devices, access to dairy. These are the two that have been troubling the United States, and they have been making a request in that respect. For India, the US tariffs on steel and aluminum, ostensibly for national security purposes, is a major issue on India's side. From the US side, another, I refer to the new crop of issues, another big issue is special and differential treatment, of which India is a big votary. But the United States feels that this is something on which the principle of self-election can no longer continue. The US has proposed a set of criteria for identifying countries as developing. In agriculture, there has been always, and this is continuing, a difference in perspective. In India, agriculture provides livelihood to millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of farmers with very small holdings. In the US, agriculture is large-scale commercial farming. In the latest, in the trade policy engagements between the two countries, are concerned, the issues are concerned with the digital trade, data localization, trans-border data flows, continuation of the regime of no customs duty on electronic transmission. I can go on and on, but with the friendly relations which was on display yesterday on the TV between the two leaders, I'm sure that we will soon have agreement on a number of issues. It's very difficult to have on all, but certainly on some. Now I'll speak briefly on the PSAG. The private sector advisory group was set up by the two governments in 2007. The objective was that the group would have discussions among themselves and come out with strategic recommendations and policy insights that could stimulate new initiatives to strengthen and expand bilateral ties. On the Indian side, Dr. Ishar Judge Ahluwalia, who is the chairperson of AMCHAM-ICRIER, was the chairperson, co-chair. And on the US side, it was Fred Bergstrom. Now, all the leaders of business and chambers of commerce were members. Not all, but the main ones. For instance, from the Indian side, the president of FICCI, and the president of CII, the president of NASCOM, and from the US side, we had one former US trade representative, a former US ambassador, and the president of the US-India Business Council, as well as the president of the Coalition of Service Industries. Now, ICRIER provided the secretariat support to the PSAG from the Indian side. We convened meetings of the PSAG and coordinated with the US counterpart, which was the Peterson Institute. Actually, in all these years, only 2 meetings of the full PSAG were held, both in 2010. And at these meetings, and this was the high point of the PSAG approved recommendations in 3 papers, which were presented simultaneously in March 2011 to the ministers in New Delhi and in Washington, D.C. The PSAG has not been active, was not active thereafter, due to the hiatus in political level dialogue in the trade policy forum. In the years from 2012 to 2013, a number of meetings were fixed, but the USTR never came to India, and all these meetings were cancelled at short notice. I mentioned that the PSAG as a group had submitted a number of papers which contained joint recommendations. And it is fascinating to go through these joint recommendations, because it is very instructive to see that the leaders of the business community on both the sides had agreed to some key recommendations. First of all was a proposal for having a US-India technology trade agreement. The paper that the recommendation that they made was to allow, first of all, to have an agreement which included things like technical standards, conformity assessment procedures, data flows, tariffs, taxation, totalization, dual use technology, and intellectual property rights. The PSAG stressed the importance of allowing flexible temporary movement of highly skilled personnel between the 2 countries. Now, this is something that India had requested, but what is significant is that both sides, the business community of both sides, agreed on this recommendation. The PSAG had recommended that the dialogue, that there should be a dialogue between the 2 countries at the level of the minister, US Secretary of State on one side and the Minister of External Affairs on the other side. And this high-level meeting should, they said, look at these recommendations of the PSAG, which included a short-term multiple entry visa for intra-company transfers. Now, the recommendations also were to explore uh, business opportunity for the US businesses to explore business opportunity in the urban infrastructure sector as well as in the logistics sector. I don't have time to go into the detail, but this is what was recommended. Now that ends my summary on PSAG and ends my remarks also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hoda. We'll come back to some of these issues, hopefully, in the discussion. May I request Sanjay Chadha, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Commerce, for his opening remarks.
Dignitaries on the dais and off the dais. I'll try and be short and sweet because I like to save things for the question and answer session. And while I will try and provide a general overview, I have certain limitations by way of a confidentiality agreement with the Assistant USTR, to which unfortunately I am a signatory. And I hope Eileen will not report this back as a violation of the confidentiality agreement. I would just like to touch upon a few topics. One of them is that we often hear this big concern of trade deficit. This was something that was started around a couple of years ago, 2016 precisely, when the US drew up a list of 10 countries with which it has a trade deficit. Unfortunately, we ranked 9. But let's just have a look at the US goods trade deficit. It's over $890 billion as of 2018. Of which half or more than half is with one country, which is our neighbor on the north. So when we look at trade deficit, and it's generally played up that, oh, this is a huge thing, we have to look at it in the light that several things contribute towards this trade deficit. We do not take into account a lot of defense procurement. Also, since this was a concern on the US side, the trade deficit has been coming down. We'll give the credit to the US side, they negotiated well. It has been coming down. 2016, it was around 24 billion, came down in 2017 to 22. Now it's 20.84 or something. And also, that SpiceJet has ordered 200 aeroplanes from Boeing. Also, we have Petronet and Tellurium signing up that MOU, so LNG will start flowing. So I think that, this concern of the trade deficit is perhaps slightly overly fixated. We have to look at it in the larger context. The United States moved up from low-tech manufacturing to high-tech manufacturing. The blue-collar jobs gave way for the white-collar jobs. You look at Apple today. Apple produces all its iPhones out of the US. But for every iPhone sold, a very substantial part of the value is realized by the Apple company. So the nature of the jobs changed. Now, when this happens, there was a disruption. There was a section of the US people who felt that jobs were going out, jobs were being outsourced. That started a concern. It spurred a political concern. It played a very big role in the 2016 elections. So, yes, we understand that jobs have to be created. Now, if you look at each country trying to have manufacturing growing in its portfolio, then there will always be a slight conflict of interest because you want certain manufacturing to happen in this country. Another country wants manufacturing to grow in its own country. So there will always be certain tariffs which would come in the way. I'll just give a brief view of what happened with us a couple of years ago. It was, I think, 1.5 years ago when this present set of issues which are there came up. They started with the US putting 25% and 10% duty on steel and aluminum, and with India reacting to it by putting countervailing duty on some products from United States. Then I think things worsened and the GSP was withdrawn. So it was in 2019 when the two leaders met that they decided that we need to have a greater convergence and let's start looking at how to address these trade issues. Let me tell you, there's been, since I'm not at liberty to discuss the elements, though I don't know why, because most of the press carries most of the elements and some of it is quite accurate, I can tell you that. So, but a large amount of convergence has been reached. Now what has happened is that when we started out in April 2019, there was a set of issues, like was said by Professor Hoda. There was an issue of medical devices companies having problems in market access. There was an issue of dairy not having an access. by December or January, all those issues on the table had been resolved. But unfortunately, along the way, since we are so interlinked with the US economy, newer and newer issues keep coming in. So then the issues of other companies which were operating also started surfacing. So yes, we have found a great deal of convergence on the goods side, but certain issues on the services side still remain open because there are a lot of companies, US companies, who enjoy a very dominant market share here. And they have concerns on preserving this market share, on preserving a market in their country. So basically those kind of issues which are still left to resolve. And I think Rajat and Mrs. Ranjana Khanna have chosen a very, should I say, appropriate or inappropriate time, because as we speak, the two leaders are also talking on this very issue in Hyderabad House. So let's wait for them when they make their announcements in the evening 5 o'clock press conference. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chadha. Now, the floor is open for questions. Please identify yourself, and may I request you to be brief. We'll collect a few questions, maybe 3 at a time, and then come back to the panel.
I'm Dinesh Sharma. I'm a freelance journalist. My question is to Mr. Chadha. What is going to be the stand of government of India on the 5G issue when the American allies like Britain and Germany, they want to use the 5G? What the government of India is going to do on that? It has allowed trial, but is it going to allow the entry of the 5G technology from China?
Other questions? Yes.
Yesterday, we saw a very warm welcome by the Prime Minister of the President of US. So, can we expect a certain amount of concession on the Iran issue with the US? Are we hopeful? Because Mr. Trump is very unpredictable. He can do anything at any moment of time. So can we expect any further movement in this regard? Thank you.
Yes. One more, and then we'll do another second round, please.
Yeah, my name is Surya. I'm a journalist. Mr. Chadha, you mentioned defense is kept out of the normal trade figures. Why is this so? I mean, since there's so much that we are procuring from the US, why is there no effort to link that into the normal trade figures?
Thank you. Sanjay, as you would expect, all the questions are directed to you. But I would request panelists to join in later. If you could have the first stab, and then the other panelists.
I think I'll start with the easiest first. You've asked a very pertinent question. Defense deals typically are never reflected in trade data because of the nature of the deal. I'm sure that you have an HS code classification. You don't have guns and bombs and mortars and all in the HS code. So whenever there is a defense procurement, it's traditionally not within the harmonized system of customs code, because this is more from the customs perspective, because the goods have to move across borders. So these harmonized codes are, the trade is primarily related to what customs has to clear. Defense, as you understand, is not really within the purview of the customs department. And there were also two issues of, are we hopeful of getting some relief on Iran? And you had asked
5G.
Allowing entry of 5G. Now, you know that the trials for the 5G have started, and there are two major companies which are going with, one Chinese company, and then there's another major giant which is going with Samsung. So we'll have to await the trials, and we'll have to see how it goes. I don't think any country has really taken a very decided view or any considered view in the matter. I think when it comes up, the concerns are already being addressed by MATI. There is no compromise on the national security concerns. These concerns would be looked at as and when the trials complete. So it's not really right now an opportune time to predict whether this is going to be allowed or it's not going to be allowed. It could go, depending on the trial.
US pressure.
Sorry?
US pressure
a lot of water has flown since, you have found US and China becoming a little less of an adversary after they signed a small mini trade deal. So it's not that there is much pressure from there. Also on Iran, again, it's hypothetical to say it's a tightrope walk for us, you know that, between Iran and the US. I think everybody's playing it by the year.
Would you like to
No,
say
these
something?
are political questions. Yeah. We'll get the difficult ones.
Okay.
You get the difficult ones,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yes, so we'll take 3 more questions. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Sudhir Grover. This is buying agent based in Delhi. I deal with the customers in Europe mainly, but are planning to get into the US market. Now, as per the recent trend of the coronavirus situation in China, and US seem to be looking at the India as another sourcing partner, because China and India are the two, especially in textiles and other areas, the main supply basis for them, for Vietnam and other countries also. Now, I want to know, what is the government strategy exactly? Government is planning to boost this supply to the US market, because US is the biggest market for the Indian manufacturers. So what exactly the policy the government has in mind to double or triple the, because ultimately we have to, because we have to increase the turnover to 3 trillion in the next 2 years, 2-3 years. So what exactly the government strategy, although we are trying to approach the importers and retailers in our own personal way, but is there any stand by the government so that this, any policy bringing the government, the concrete steps I like to know from the government, what they want to take it in the next
Thank you.
future?
Thank you. Yes. Yes, please.
Dr. Kapoor, I'm a consultant on strategy. The converse part of his question, what is it that the American companies want for them to look at India as part of the supply chain, which they are able to do when they move out of China, going to Vietnam, Thailand, and whatever? Right? What is it that they are asking? He says what the government should do. My question is, what are they asking, and are we trying to address that question? The second is that, you know, in the budget, or prior to the budget, the government has reduced the tax for new companies who are setting up in 2019 and who go into manufacturing by 2023. You are seeing companies like Unilever, etc., beginning to start putting up manufacturing capabilities of their own, both for domestic and global. What is it that, you know, why is it that we're not talking enough about this and talking about this opportunity to American companies? And here AmCham can really do that, that this is a window of opportunity, low taxation, this is a huge market, both for this market as well as for global supply. Why are we not talking more about that and encouraging them on this?
Okay. One more behind you. Yes, please.
I'm Gautam Mahajan. I used to be president of the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. And going back many years, and I suspect it's still true, many of the issues that you talk about are not bilateral issues. They exist with every country that we deal with. For example, customs duties. There's no special duty for the US, which is different from the duty for the Europeans. But we always found that the US tended to make much more noise about these things and did less business than they potentially could, because this noise prevented them from doing business. So this even playing field does exist. I'm sure that 10% of the issues that are truly bilateral. The other thing that we don't talk enough about is the Indian investment in the US and the potential to do much more in the US.
Okay, thank you. I think, let me maybe invite Mr. Atul Dhawan to sort of respond to that, with preface that, this conversation about how India can advantage, not just the coronavirus, temporary thing, but, in the past when it's becoming more expensive to do business in India and you wanted to invite a lot of businesses, to do business in China and invite a lot of business to India. But it hasn't happened, and this narrative keeps playing out in the press. If you could throw some light on that as well.
I'll try and rationalize this, but the attempt to change supply chain towards countries outside China has been an effort that's been going on for some time. It's not new. And I think also it takes a little time for infrastructure to be set up before you can address manufacturing. Having said that, I don't think we moved fast enough as a country when the opportunity first arose. And I think it's the way we are organized, although we've delayed bureaucracy and delayed bottlenecks considerably over the years, I don't think we are agile enough to grab an opportunity and react to it. So, I know, for example, a lot of chemical industries have started moving to India because we had some infrastructure in place. We had good manufacturing practices in place for the chemical industries. I'm told our standards for pollution are more stringent than China, but yet the industries have moved to India. The chemical industry is an example. Somebody needs to do this analysis to see what the chemical industry did right to move production to India. I think there is also hesitation. Somebody asked the question about what do the American companies want. Looking at, if we try and talk to the American companies through the chamber, I think the ability to react and the ability to have an infrastructure move production from place of manufacture to ports and beyond is maybe one of the biggest challenges. I remember a statistic a couple of years back, that in India, we move something like 200 kilometers a day. A truck takes a day to move 200, 250 kilometers. The US, on the other hand, does 700 miles, I think, a day. So you see the difference in the efficiency parameters. We need to build that out. I think the expectation that we will move manufacturing to India without looking at the attendant variables around it may be hard to achieve. So it's not impossible. We need to be more agile to take those opportunities. We did that, by the way, in the SARS issue. You bring the example of coronavirus. When SARS hit, a lot of the automotive component manufacturing moved to India. But that was also because the facilities existed. We were already trying to build up an auto industry in India, and we were able to then use that to take the opportunity. So that is one of the issues. On the coronavirus, it's again the same thing. We really don't know where this is going to play out. I don't think anybody knows where this is going to play out in the next 6 months. But what has come out very clear to global companies is that you have to create alternative supply chains. You cannot be dependent on one. So the next 3 to 5 years is a time I think we need to look at grabbing those opportunities. Did I miss something?
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I'd just like to add here in this room that the US companies today have the largest FDI. It exceeds over $66 billion. Not only that, they also gainfully engage and employ more than 5 million people in India. That's a huge contribution. And they've been here since 1902, not till now. The second thing is, yes, this is the opportunity for India to seize, to step into the global value chain. AMCHAM had just released a report of the $5 trillion economy a few days back. And we were actually targeting at working on a report for taking the Indian economy to $10 trillion. There is potential. What we need is greater ease of doing business. US companies are looking for infrastructure, something that Mr. Dhawan's already talked about. And the most important thing is that we are looking at predictability of the taxation structure. Bringing down of the corporate tax was great, but then for companies which are importing equipment and components for working out in India, the taxes, the import duties on components are added in, which makes it very difficult for the US companies to predict appropriate balance sheets. So these are a few of the deterrents that we have. We've been working very closely with Invest India, trying to have better ease of doing business. And I think that is also quite obvious that they've come down. India has come down by 70 notches in the ranking in the last 2 years, but we have a long way to go.
Yes. Sanjay ji.
I'll just supplement what has been said. Somebody very rightly asked about what are we doing about coronavirus. As you understand that we dependent on China for a lot of material which are intermediaries and primary products. If we don't get APIs from China, our pharma industry gets hit. A large number of uppers and soles are taken from China. So we did an analysis of HS code 8-digit wise, what are the lines which are critical, where we are overly dependent on China. Then similarly, we also looked at, global value chains have got disrupted. There are value chains where China and we, for instance, static converter, a small item, China exports 4.5 billion to US. We export a little under billion. So maybe there is a value chain which needs to be filled up there. So this was shared with all the export promotion councils, with the industry bodies, with our missions, all this study, these were shared. Now, while we will look at B2B meetings, I'll just share with you our little experience which we had about a year ago. As you're aware, when the US-China trade war started, a similar opportunity was there because the US started looking for India. So we arranged video conference with two of the biggest buyers, Costco and Walmart and all. Now, please understand, it was not so much an issue of cost or quality. It was an issue of scaling up, generating exportable surpluses. In one of the video conference I was sitting in, he asked the person that, can you supply 40,000 pieces? And that person said, well, I can supply 20,000 pieces in a year. He says, sir, I'm asking for 40,000 pieces in a quarter. So, the guy said, and you can't blame the industry. They said, look, if we ramp up the production, we invest in ramping up production. Tomorrow, if it becomes, the trade deal goes away or this scenario changes, then what happens to our investment? And, making investment right now, they're facing great difficulties, bank loans, everything. There are a lot of challenges in trying to ramp up capacities. So, scaling up the capacities is a big challenge. But yes, we are looking at, safeguarding our value chains. We are looking at, maybe it's a time when we should start making APIs in this country or looking at alternate sources of API. Because there has to be a strategy in the short run to insulate yourself from the shocks. Because you have to keep your industry going. And 62% of imports from China are intermediaries. The finished goods are less than 20%. So you have to look at protecting yourself. The second was asked very nicely that what do these American companies want? Now here I'll just tell you, if you look at a Nomura report, Nomura Inc. did a lot of study on what happened as the fallout of the US-China standoff and which Asian countries benefited. So they looked at around 58 countries which relocated. I would say relocated. They did not invest more in China. They tried to diversify by putting eggs in more than one basket. A disproportionately large number, 28, went to Vietnam, 11 to Thailand. We got 3, all 3 electronics, Bistron. Now here, again, if we see what did Vietnam and others do right, they created something called a plug-and-play environment. What they offered was a ready piece of land where you could move in, you could register quickly. Some of the Indians who invested there told us that I came back in 17 days with a loan, with a company registered there, with manufacturing facility and a plot of land. And he says, can I do this in our own country? That's a challenge, I agree. Also, sir, you said the over fixation on customs duty. Now, a lot of people have this, at least in the developing countries, have this joke that what the developing countries do with their tariffs, the developed countries do with their standards. So you can always use, for instance, we have a free trade agreement with Japan. Now, both the sides, the steel lines are free. We get a lot of imports from Japan, but our exporters are never able to export. And they say Japan has unfairly high quality standards. Now, somewhere lies the truth, we really don't know, but this is often the refrain of our exporters. So it's an issue which really has no straight answers. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll come back to the audience in a bit. May I give the floor to Professor Arpita for a brief comment?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sanjay ji because when you look into China, you have to also see that China gives lower income tax to foreign service providers. So the benefits in China in some cases are very, very lucrative. They also offered startup visas to the US companies and they have streamlined their SEZ policies in terms of giving the WTO right subsidies. If you read the USTR report on China and Vietnam, they will always say that their policy Second thing is that when we talk about, attracting US companies, US is a very private-oriented market, and we are very private-oriented market, and China is a very, market which is ruled by the government. Now, US companies today have a feeling that they don't know which market India is, especially after Amazon came in and the FDI comment. They were expecting a comment that, Amazon would be able to invest in India if it gives a sourcing commitment. But they never expected a comment that, FDI is not wanted. So the smaller companies are a little, out of place, and they need a bit of hand-holding by chambers and others to say that India is a very welcoming market. Indian investment in US is growing, and I think a number of Indian public sector enterprises, a geostrategic thing, wants to invest in other markets like Africa along with the US, and there is a very good scope for India and US to collaborate. And given that both are going for Indo-Pacific, this is an area where India and US company needs to really focus on how they can work together. But for that, US has to be a little bit more receptive to state-owned enterprises, which India cannot throw away at this stage. So there are many issues that needs to be resolved, and if it resolves, I think there is a huge business partnership opportunity.
Thank you, Arpita. Yes, we'll take more questions. There's many more questions coming up. May I give people who haven't asked a question an opportunity? This lady here, please. We'll come back to you.
Hi. This is in relation to what somebody had mentioned.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Rishika Taneja. I do public policy at Apple. This is in relation to a question that somebody had brought up earlier, why India can't shine out as an alternative to China and Vietnam. And you had rightly mentioned, Mr. Chadha, that the Nomura report talks about how Vietnam, most companies ended up choosing Vietnam as an option. So in the recent past, we've heard a lot about how India faces disabilities vis-a-vis China and Vietnam. In that context, how is the government, or in what ways the government trying to address these disabilities that have come up to encourage manufacturing to come into India?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question back there? Yeah, then I'll come. Let this be the ladies' round.
My name is Priscilla. I'm a journalist from The Hindu. One thing I'd just like to follow up on that question about trade deficit and that it doesn't include defense procurement and other things. Do you have an estimate of what it would be if it included such figures? That's one thing, just a follow-up. The other thing is about agriculture and especially the dairy sector. Farmers groups have expressed concern about any trade deal that would include opening up agri and especially dairy, and I believe some of those concerns are what led India to step out of RCEP. So the question is being asked, why, if that concern was taken into account with RCEP, why is that on the table now with the US? Are the same issues on the table? And is there any way in which opening up those sectors to the US would be beneficial to India and Indian farmers in ways that it wasn't with RCEP or with Southeast Asian?
Yes, thank you. We'll do another, we'll come back.
Yeah, this is Shaun Ray from ICRIER. We've heard that, in the last, not this budget, the previous budget, that there could be a hike in the FDI for insurance. Do you see that happening sometime soon? And is this something that is part of the discussions that is going on?
Sanjay ji, this is your round.
This is an unfair question. So I'll back out of it most easily this way because I told you I'll not discuss the elements of the package as yet. Yes, there is a request from their side, but I won't like to say anything more at this stage about insurance. Lady, you had mentioned from Apple. You're from Apple, right? With Virat. One of the very active persons in this discussions. See, you rightly said there are when we look at China, we look at a lot of competitive manufacturing. We did a study in around 2018. If you see the cost of capital in China, the rates are 5 to 6%. Now, ours are almost double that. Similarly, if you look at the logistic cost in this country, it's pretty high. We are a large landlocked country and our internal logistic costs are high. The cost of power in India is almost 2.5 times the cost of power in China. So the challenge really lies in trying to make our own manufacturing competitive. Because if your manufacturing is competitive, then these kind of tariffs do not become such a great concern to the industry. But unfortunately, we have to traverse a long distance to still reach there. And there are huge challenges on the way. So yes, you're right that, I mean, there is no substitute for competitive manufacturing. And finally, we do hope to get there one day where we can look at that. And you've incidentally opened your first plant in US in 2019. So it's a very big departure. Apple never made anything in US, and I was told by Virat that we did it under duress because we had to put something in the US also. Okay. And the lady mentioned date.
Just 1 second while you're going on to that question. I have a question for you on the same one. When you're talking about competitive manufacturing, there are times that India's existing FTAs have become deterrents for the US companies operating in India. Because if they find as global companies that they can get the same items that they're going to be manufacturing and even supplying in India done better in one of the ASEAN FTA countries, they would use that for their own balance sheet. And there have been cases when the whole productions have been diverted there because we couldn't kind of find out differences in giving lead times to companies for manufacturing from their existing this thing and supplementing the cost. Now, are you planning to relook at your FTAs which are becoming deterrents to India's own manufacturing policy?
Okay, should I start with your answer? Okay.
You can combine ourselves.
Okay. Like you rightly said, what happens in a free trade agreement is that initially when we started looking at the two big ones with Japan and Korea, one, the utilization rates were very low on our side. So obviously there was a need for the industry to get on board. But having said that, we also must recognize that the FTAs are not a single way ticket. They're supposed to be providing advantages on both sides. So while we have an aggressive interest in penetrating their markets, we have to also be prepared that there will be some interest from the other side to come in. So you have to guard what is sensitive to you. And let me tell you, Koreans and Japanese did their FTAs rather well. They first planned the investments. They looked at the automobile companies. They knew that the automobile companies are going to be requiring steel. So they negotiated very hard on steel. I understand that the US companies feel that the steel comes in duty-free from there. But that is the way it was negotiated, and that is the way these countries do it. Every country does the FTA like that. So one has to be prepared that, look, if we want to get something, we have to concede something too. It will never be that an FTA will be a win-lose situation. It will always be a win-win situation. Absolutely. So whenever we do an FTA, we have to be prepared on what we need. The second part is if you don't do an FTA, you don't get access to the market too, because some concessions are being ceded by the other side. Yes, it's a concern, but I don't think the US companies have expressed it as a very major breaking point with India. I think they're more concerned with reforms and competitive manufacturing and ease of doing business than they are with really our FTAs.
Thank you, sir.
And on dairy, again, I would just like to say that, see, this is the kind of thing which is, you want a deal, but you don't want to concede anything. Please understand that the balance has to be struck. We are not looking at hugely disadvantaging our dairy system, but without disclosing the element, all I can tell you is that if you can concede a little bit, say a fraction, a very small fraction of your dairy and get something else in return, which could be useful to another section of your industry, then that's what the negotiation is all about. Sorry? I couldn't understand.
Sorry, I had asked about
defense data.
I don't think the defense ministry will take kindly if I start looking at that data at all, because they keep it a very closely guarded secret.
Okay, there's so many questions. It took time to warm up. Yes, let me take these three questions and I'll come this side. This gentleman there.
Morning, Mr. Chadha. My name is Vibhav. I'm a member of Healthcare Committee of AMCHAM. Just a quick reflection of yours needed on. So we talk about a lot on medical device imports to our country, which is like 70%. But one is obviously it is by value and not by volume. If you really see the volume, it may not be as big as we think about. But on, if you see the other side of the coin, this medical device import to the country is also giving a very healthy medical tourism industry in the country, which was 3 billion in 2015 and expected to touch 9 billion like next 2 years. So I understand that is because of also the high quality of doctors and hospitals in the country, but also other side, availability of cutting edge technologies in the country, which is making this industry flourish. So do you think that this balance should really be maintained rather than sort of holding imports of medical devices?
Thank you.
Hi, sir. Rituparna this side from CNBC. I wanted some understanding on the quote unquote the big trade deal. Now, when the other side talks about the big trade deal, it clearly is talking about a free trade agreement. But the way US works around a free trade agreement is it's not just only about tariffs. It's also about so many other issues. So my question to you, sir, and the people on the panel is, does India have the appetite to for example, engage with the US on investments? Because I think they want something like pre-investment national treatment and other conditions which are there. Then IPR, US has been talking about compulsory licensing. It's talking about doing away with Section 3D of the IPR Act. Does India have that appetite to engage with US not only on tariffs? Tariffs, we have seen what kind of negotiations have happened. We have been following up. But on IPR and investments and on other issues, will India have that appetite to take forward the talks?
Thank you. Yes, there's a question here. Then I'll take 5 questions in this round because I think there are many questions. Yes,
yeah,
please.
I'm Professor Jindal. I'm Group Pro VC MIT University. We've been trying to promote higher education in USA as well, but we see it's not very much open for, especially for Indian universities. We have developed the topmost high-ranking campus in Dubai, while in India the case is just the reverse. The government universities are top-ranked. In US, the top-ranked university QS ranking are private universities. So what is the scope of the tie-up and their openness in regard of welcoming Indian private universities who have already proved their mark in terms of their infrastructure, their education, and other things?
Yes, there was a question here. Is there? No. Okay. What? No, sorry. Can I have the gentleman who hasn't asked a question there? I'll come back to you in the next round, please. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Devjit and I'm from KPMG. So my question is that, I mean, while we talk about Apples and Gs and the kind of contribution that they've made to trade, and the bilateral dynamic, and say Amazon investing and Apple investing and everything. But if you look at both the democracies, it's the small and medium enterprises which is the linchpin. So and if the relationship between the two countries has to be sustainable from an economics point of view, I think tying these two industries in both the countries is very important from a sustainability perspective. And our aspiration is to reach 500 billion in terms of bilateral trade by 2025. What role do you think, 2 questions. One, what role do you think small and medium enterprises in both these countries make in this contribution? And second, what is government, from an Indian government perspective, how do you think the government can actually attract the small and medium enterprises in the US, where the definition is much higher compared to India, the thresholds are much higher, and they are much more profitable and they are global in their approach? How do you take that? What are some of the steps?
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Arpita, you had a question, and then I'll come back to the panel.
I have a question for you, Sanjay ji, and for general. You see, trade agreements are becoming very complex, and we as researchers, you look at us very nicely, and we as researchers are supposed to be all expert and providing you the right inputs. And what we find is that the Commerce Ministry only approaches us as the nth order at the last hour with goods and services just to give our general knowledge feedback and do stakeholders consultation. Why are we not approached to do deep research? Why are we not approached today to study on dairy?
Sanjay ji, again, let me start with you, but I'll invite Atul and Ranjana if they want to say anything, Professor Hoda. But could you start, Sanjay ji? There are many questions.
The duty as charged, because yes, a lot of people feel we don't do enough stakeholder consultations, but let me just say something in my defense. We do have a few in-house bodies like Center for WTO Research, we have Center for Research in Trade, And it's not that we don't do that. There is a systematic approach. There is a joint study group which identifies the items. We do look at all these studies as they are required. Now, as I mentioned in dairy, it's not so much an economic issue, as was mentioned by her. It's more of a political one. That are you going to open up dairy because you have a small 2-cow kind of a cooperative setup and he has big dairy farms? Now, are we going to look at even opening up a fraction of it? Economically, it may make sense to just open up a small fraction, but it's not going to be a purely economic call. It's going to be a sort of a political economic call. So yes, we would like to engage deeper, and I assure you that we welcome and we fund any studies. I mean, Rajat will bear with me. Of course, he's slightly upset because some of them didn't get to reach conclusion, but we would like to engage.
Sorry, Arpita. The question on medical devices and the link with medical tourism.
Okay, I'll do that. See, you're not from AdvaMed, are you?
No.
I represent AdvaMed also. That's why. So you are the guy who took away our GSP. For everybody's concern, it was AdvaMed who filed a complaint in the USTR that they don't have market access. But sir, let me tell you, the AdvaMed has agreed to the formulation. See, please understand that there were certain components of the medical thing which had runaway prices. You're aware of it. You had stents going a lakh and plus, which came down to very reasonable prices. Yes, we also appreciate the concern that if there is a technically superior product, then how do you compensate it for being technically superior? So I think the present formulation, which I'll not divulge at this stage, does take care of it, and it took us 7 months of discussion with every stakeholder, every company, the domestic and the US. And I think the minister himself chaired a couple of those meetings where we did try to work out, and because it has to balance all these stakeholders. So let's see. And the most difficult one was by Rituparna, which I think I should pass whether we have an appetite or not. I'll leave it to the academicians because they should be the ones guiding us whether we have an appetite or not.
Atul, Ranjana, Professor Hoda.
Just one more.
Yeah.
On the higher education you mentioned, that's a very pertinent point. See, just for a figure, the US students contribute around $6 billion annually to the US exchequer. That's a huge amount of money. Yes, private to private, there have been some success stories. I believe Manipal is a very good success story where they have a lot of sandwich courses with the US universities, study 2 years in India, 2 years in US, get a degree from there. So it's more at an individual level, but if there is any facilitation that's required, we'll be very happy to put you in touch with our embassy and through our embassy to the relevant people if you have any kind of a plan or if you have any kind of a this thing. We could arrange for some meetings where you could take this initiative.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rajat and Sanjay, and for the group at large, I just have a philosophical question, really. I'm giving it back. What do we as a country want to do? You know, you keep getting this debate about, and we're really talking numbers, 8 billion, 2 billion, 9 billion. What is it that we want as our aspiration? If you want to be a 5 trillion economy, you've got to talk scale. You cannot work on smaller scales. You cannot just equate yourself to the US or any other Western economy unless you're at scale. I was just looking at some data as they were talking. We have a $50 billion deficit, trade deficit with the US. We have a $150 billion trade, and we are talking about a $500 billion trade. The trade deficit between the US and China is $400 billion. So where do you think the attention of the US is going to go? So I mean, as a country, we need to be clear of where we want to head. I think that debate is also pretty much very, very important, because that is what you would give as an input to the government. That is what you would give as an input to the private sector. We as the private sector can't get up and say, how do we double our exports? The question really is, how do you participate in that 5 trillion economy? How do you get us there? So I think scale is very important. unless we talk scale, we're not going to be able to address the issues we are talking about today.
Atul, I sort of disagree a little bit with you, and I'll tell you why. You know, you mentioned chemicals. We're probably the cheapest place in the world to manufacture fine chemicals. China can't compete with us. But the reason for that is that these are relatively small scale, small scale units compared to large chemical plants. What's happening in the world, and I think we need as a country to take notice of this, is that the US and a lot of us who were brought up with thinking about large scale manufacturing are now moving to smaller distributed manufacturing. We should now start also looking at that. The scale will come by a large number of these guys contributing to
So, although I'm not sure what the disagreement is. I mean, if as a country we're not going to scale, we're not going to talk as equals to the other side. So,
There was also a question, Professor Hoda, on MSMEs. Do you want to take that, or Sanjay ji, you want to take that? Anybody?
Yes, you're right, because most of our exports is with MSME. It's not driven like the Korean cheoballs where half of the exports is with 5 companies. But having said that, please understand that our definition of MSME is quite different from the definition and size of the MSMEs globally. So our MSMEs are really these small guys. It is for this reason that we have what we call the Market Access Initiative Scheme, where all our MSMEs are eligible for this. We arrange B2B meetings, we arrange reverse seller, buyer meets and all that. But that's about what we are planning to do given their size. You have, I think most of you must be aware of Global Soft. Global Soft was something which was given to a smaller council and not to NASSCOM. Because the idea was that get the smaller, the mid-sized and small companies from US to integrate with the smaller IT companies in Bangalore and in Andhra Pradesh. So there are several schemes of this sort where the MSMEs are given a lot of support, are given access, they are given certain reimbursements, like testing charges become prohibitive for them. So we have a scheme under which some of those testing charges are reimbursed to the MSMEs if they are fitting into the MSME. So we do provide support to the MSMEs. But again, yes, the MSMEs find it very difficult to scale up and they are really small.
Professor Hoda, did you want to say?
I would like to make some observations that would supplement and complement what has already been said on supply chains. And this is also relevant to MSMEs investment inflows. I think there was a concern that we have not been able to fill in the gap that occurred in the supply chains during the trade war, and maybe even because of the coronavirus or whatever. Now, Mr. Dhawan already said something about logistics difficulties. I would just like to add that we cannot get into the, or in order to get into the supply chains, we have to get additional investment in manufacturing. And in order to get additional investment, we have to look at a number of issues which are impediments to investment and which are really, which really make the environment for investment not very conducive in the country. Mr. Dhawan mentioned logistics. Logistics is perhaps the most important element of this, both logistics infrastructure and logistics processes. But in addition, we have other things also. We have resolved a big impediment, more or less, by introducing the GST, because that was a very big impediment. We think we have resolved the corporate income tax, corporate tax thing also. But I don't think quite, because investors still complain bitterly about not the corporate rate of tax, but about the corporate tax environment. they say that the environment here, the biggest element in that is the discomfort about retrospective taxation. Now, there are a number of things. Someone said plug and play, lack of, and so on and so forth. There are issues regarding land, there are issues regarding labor. All these add up to make the environment not very good. That's why new investment has not taken place. Why did Vietnamese companies fill in the gap? How did they succeed in filling in the gap? Because there was additional investment. Who invested in Vietnam? Korean companies invested in Vietnam in order to supply the goods that were being earlier supplied only by China. So in order to get into the supply chains more effectively, we have to look at all these logistics and land and labor, and on everything something is being done. It is not that nothing is being done. I'll give you only one element. The dedicated freight corridor has been in implementation on the western side for 10 years. Now, I have been following it very much because I was the chairman of the committee that recommended that dedicated freight. But we have been expecting it so long, it is just not coming. Maybe it will come next year. The last time I heard was that 2019 it would come. But 2019 has gone, it has not come. Then, you know, the first cabinet decision on the industrial corridor was taken in 2007. Now, there is not much in public domain from which we know what really has happened in this corridor, the industrial corridor. I think the idea certainly was to have provision for plug and play, so that when you have opportunities like what arose during the trade war, we can, trade war between the US and China, the manufacturers and investors could come in and start their manufacturing, also with the help of the supply chain. But I don't know how much has happened. I will not say that nothing has happened, but nothing much is evident as having happened. And this first cabinet decision was taken 13 years back to set up this. So the question regarding MSME is also answered by this. If you improve the environment by attending to 7 issues, did I say 7? 7 issues starting with logistics, then MSME's investment will start coming from outside, and not only MSMEs, but others too. Thank you very much.
Yes, there's a question there.
My question is to Mr. Chandra. I'm a journalist. I just wanted to, it's a follow-up question on RCEP and dairy and the US. I think you were asked whether...
Name, please.
Mandira. I work with the week. The question was that there was an issue with concerns with dairy in the RCEP deal, and we sort of kind of withdrew because of that. So is it more advantageous with the US, or is it about political will?
Yes, you had a question here.
So this is back to philosophy. In 1991, we decided that, we would open up, and there was the Bombay Club which said, no, you can't do it, we will all get destroyed, and we know what happened. Is it not time to do 1991 once again?
Yes. Yeah, Ramesh Ramadurai from 3M. So this is Mr. Chadha earlier in response to a question on disabilities talked about some of our lack of competitive situation in the country. question to Mr. Chadha or Mr. Dhawan. Do you believe we are taking enough actions through the budget and otherwise to address these lack of competitive situation, whether it's in power or infrastructure, roads? I think those were some of the areas you referred to, Mr. Chadha. So are we really taking definitive actions to improve our competitive position?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Sudhir Gurwar again. So basically, well, like my question was answered, Mr. Sanjay Chadha, but actually I'm not totally convinced with the answer, to be very frank. Right, because the thing is, like for the last 2 years, because of the US, like there was a issue of the tariffs 2 years back, and I have attended a lot of seminars and the textile policy also. A lot of things were discussed, what kind of infrastructure needs to be done, suggestions were taken, but practically from the industry knowledge and all, not much has been done, because as you know, the scalability of operations are needed to serve the US market. That is very, very true. But thing is, in which area we need to scale up the infrastructure, that needs to be minutely looked into, and I have answers for those, because I have a very large experience in the industry, 33 years in the industry. And I feel that not only the infrastructure, there needs to be change in the attitude and the quality training. Thing is, like we have a FTA with Japan, a free trade with Japan with zero duty on textile products. And still that we have just 1% of business going to Japan from India. This is we can't just go with a business just because we can't meet the quality standards. When the other country can, when Vietnam can do it, why can't India? And secondly, we also need to analyze why the business is going from China to Vietnam. Like for example, 2 years back, out of 120 companies which wanted to shift from China, only 13 companies came to India, rest gone to Vietnam and Cambodia. The thing is, like, there needs to be facilities or processing facility. I'm just giving a small example of textiles.
Can you conclude the question, please?
Yeah. Question is basically like we need to have because we need to make India prepare for the world, because right now we are thinking of just meeting the India needs, and whatever is a little extra, we need to cater to that other parts of the world. We need to build ourselves to prepare for the world, like what the China was doing it. We need to, because we have the large reserves of the raw material in India, and
may I request you, Mr. Grover, that
one more point I have, because thing is, like, basically we want to improve the exports from India to US and other countries. Indian embassies, basically, they are not practically doing the work, basically, which Indian embassies in the foreign countries, I'm saying is, if you ask for the foreign buyers' addresses and all, we get the 10 years old data and the all mails get bounced up. So we need to make sure that those embassies really constructively work for the benefits. And secondly, last point I have is, because I am from the buying agency industries, from a federation called Federation of Buying Agents, government needs to work hand in hand, hand-holding needs to be done with the buying agents, because we are people from 5 years to 45 years in the industry. So we have experience in different streams. If the government, manufacturers, and the buying agent work in harmony with each other, we have solutions to many problems where actually the efforts needs to be done. And we are ready to support the government in all the issues that can come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think so. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. Amitabh Kumar from the American Chambers of Commerce. My question is really, can we look at accelerating the energy sector to underpin the economic partnership? Energy sector is very big in India. And within energy, we can look at conventional oil and gas, because we've been big importers of oil, big importers of gas, and we've had many diversified suppliers over the years. So if we can start focusing more on US as a big supplier for our energy requirements, as well as technology going forward, then I think there can be a quid pro quo where then we can expect from the US. Thank you.
Okay, one last question, and then I'll come back to the panelists.
Good afternoon. This is Bhakti Anand from British High Commission. I have one question regarding the US-Mexico-Canada trade deal. There was a provision that the automotives will be given zero tariff if the labor involved in making that part is earning a minimum wage of $16 per hour. Now that is being touted as really improving the remuneration of Mexican laborers. Can we expect a similar provision in India and US agreement?
Okay. I think the gentleman back there has his hand up for a long time, so I want to deprive him. Yes.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Arijit. I represent the IT industry.
and I'm a person who does economics and amalgamation of economics and technology. My question is quite different here. We recently have heard the PDB bill and the controversy surrounding it, and the US companies accusing that cross-border data flow is not going to happen. So my question here is that, can India think of creating a bilateral treaty between the US and India on sharing data mechanism and jointly developing predictive analytics tools? Because let's be honest over here, by 2030, predictive analytics tools is going to be about $35 trillion business, and that's going to be a huge amount of money. And India is a huge fertile ground for harvesting data. So can you work on that kind of mechanism?
Thank you. I'm sorry to the rest that we haven't been able to ask questions, but there will be an interaction over lunch, so you're welcome to interact with whoever panelists are here during lunch. May I give the floor now back to all the panelists, starting with Sanjay ji, and then I'll request all the panelists to give their final remarks based on the questions that have just been asked.
Agree with that, and we would be happy to have your views, because we have been working on how to make the missions more effective. In fact, we are very happy that FIO came out with something called India Trade Portal, which never existed. Now the India Trade Portal, we are telling all our embassies that when you read the newspaper, translate a business opportunity and upload it, so that a person sitting out here gets to know of a tender inquiry or a business opportunity in a country, putting the contact details. So this is a small beginning, but I think it's a good initiative which has been started by the industry itself. We have provided support by way of writing to our missions and telling them that, you can directly upload this. Yeah, so we'd welcome such ideas, and we would definitely, I totally agree with you that we have to work with our missions to make things happen better. And I totally agree with all the suggestions that you made. And yeah, please, you're most welcome. Most welcome. Also, I think, Damu, would you like to take the question on dairy RCEP? We have the chief negotiator of RCEP with us, so maybe he can
Mike, please.
Thank you, Sanjay and Rajat. Well, as at this stage, it's not good to tell exactly what happened, because there's so many issues in RCEP. It's just not dairy. There are many other issues where perhaps we felt there was the deal was not good. But I think let's not blame issues in the RCEP, but actually, in my view, the real orientation is very important. Are we going to be? Do we want to be an exporting country? That orientation has to change. We can do any deal. Why RCEP? We can do even a deal with the US. But I think largely the industry has to get to this thinking, do we really want to be an exporting country or not? And if they want to be an exporting industry, that's an important element, because if you don't correct that perception, then you will always be defensive. You'll always think that your domestic turf is all, the be-all and end-all. And I think that's where is the calculation going wrong. And there's a lot of research. In fact, the Commerce Department, we do a lot of interaction with stakeholders. And I can tell you personally that in every time we did a round, we've done extensive stakeholder consultation across the country. And I can tell you with all honesty, that in the last 5 years that I've been in the RCEP negotiations, we have done more than 100 stakeholder consultations across the country, and we've engaged think tanks. ICRIER is one of the bodies we've engaged to do a study for us, and we value their comments. Similarly, CRT was another body, the Center for WTO Studies on Services, the IMF Bangalore. They have constantly been interacting with us, but I think the real problem is how do we think in terms of the narrative, how do you want to change the way we think, the way we do business? That's very important. In fact, I can say again, for every 8-digit HS code, we've done extensive studies. But I think in the calculation at the end, something else comes in. Someone else's interest prevails, and that takes away the entire picture, the real meat of the negotiations. And even in RCEP, we've never been weak. I think India's position was extremely hard, very strong. We've been a tough negotiator. We were able to get most of what we wanted. But at the end of the day, the deal, certain sectors didn't suit some, and there is a political call at the end of the day, so things didn't happen. But I believe that even the US deal, if we go down to the negotiating table and look into every aspect, there is immense potential for us. And on balance, you have to think, if you're giving, you will gain also. It cannot be that one side, as Sanjay rightly said, you have to give to gain. And that is your broader picture. Thank you.
All I wanted to just say was that, the partnership that is the basic theme of our deliberations today is really poised to be one of the most important global partnerships, benefiting both the countries. Like you said, it's got to be a win-win. The US industry in India has been a part of the fabric. They've not just been here doing business, which is somehow got a message that I got at one point of time saying they're only here to do business to make money. And I just wanted to clarify that the US companies, nobody in the world does business where the bottom line is not green. Nobody do that. But the US companies have engaged far more than anybody else in the entire fabric of the Indian community, in India's partnership and inclusive growth. And that is where we want more of them to kind of come in and work with the Indian government in their missions to be able to take India to really the next height. And since US is the largest trading partner of India, we are looking also at trade as one of the big drivers. Thank you.
Atul, would you like to say something at the end?
Ranjana covered what I had to say. Thank you.
Okay, I think all good things must come to an end, and I'm not going to sort of try and summarize the very rich discussion that happened, but thank you all so much for coming, and I think it's been a very productive morning. The only thing I'd like to say is that the US and India sort of natural partners, I think, and the approach to trade, India is still sort of worried about tariffs, customs duties as a way to promote its make in India, and I think on the level of development that we are in, that is something that we ought to do, and as countries, I'm not saying raise customs duty, but we ought to promote manufacturing. What is the right way to do it? You've heard from everybody today. How can we promote and scale up domestic manufacturing? I think that's going to be an important instrument for our economic development. But the United States is at a very different level of development compared to us. So we become natural partners trade, as I'd said in my opening remarks as well. Trade between dissimilar countries is sort of beneficial all around. But we have to worry about how those benefits are going to be distributed within countries. And so that's our internal issues. Often trade becomes the victim of lack of domestic redistribution. And that's been seen, in globalization as well. One question that came up, which was not addressed, but I think it's important to sort of understand, is that when we move to higher levels of development, and the lady asked the question about, fixing minimum wages in trade deals, it's like, you're imposing standards across borders, and that's where trade deals are moving today. And those standards could be mutual recognition arrangements, e-procurement, competition policy, labor standards, state-owned enterprises, as well as, as I said, e-procurement, government procurement. So all those that were a part of TPP, that's where trade deals will move in the future. Customs duties, tariffs might become passé. Maybe it'll take time, but that's where trade deals would migrate to. We'll have more emphasis on standards and more emphasis on non-tariff barriers rather than on tariff barriers, because as you know, WTO has been fairly successful in getting the rest of the world, getting the global trade regime to come to fairly low levels of tariff. Our own tariff levels from 300% tariff levels, pre-liberalization have come down to about 10%. So that's good news. But the days of unilateral liberalization, as you heard today, something that India used to push a lot, the days of unilateral liberalization, I won't say are over, but you're looking for a give and take, as both Mr. Dammu Ravi and Mr. Chadha have said. We're looking for give and take. If you're going to give something, then you expect countries to give you back in return. But as I said, this has been a very rich discussion. We've learned a lot we learn a lot in ICRIER through engagements like this, and we're very grateful to AMCHAM for collaborating with us on the sidelines, as I said, of an important visit. And thank you, Mr. Ravi. Thank you, Sanjay ji, for coming, of course. Thank you, Professor Hoda and Arpita, Atul ji, and also Ranjana for doing this with us. And thank you all, especially, for coming to this morning. And you're all invited for lunch. Thank you.